The soft hum of the bedside lamp cast a golden glow across the dimly lit bedroom, its light flickering faintly against the rain-streaked window. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Sarah Collins lay beneath, the covers, her body still, her breath slow and steady, but sleep had yet to claim her. She watched as Buddy, her golden retriever, paced restlessly across the wooden floor, his nails clicking softly with each step. His ears twitched, his nose, working the air, his tail stiff with unease. He moved with purpose, circling the bed, then stopping, his deep brown eyes locked onto her. His golden fur shimmered under the lamp's glow, but it was his expression that sent a ripple of unease through her. He wasn't just restless. He was worried. Buddy let out a low whine, stepping forward, nudging her arm with his cold, wet nose. His breath was warm against her skin, and his whimper grew more insistent as he pressed his head against her side. Sarah frowned, shifting beneath the covers. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, her voice thick with exhaustion. She reached out, scratching gently behind his ears, expecting him to settle. But he didn't. Instead, he nudged harder, pressing against her chest with unwavering urgency. His whines turned into soft, desperate whimpers, his eyes pleading with her to understand. Sarah sighed, shifting slightly, trying to ignore the uncomfortable pit growing in her stomach. Buddy had always been affectionate, but this was different. This was insistence. This was fear. She let out a breath and pressed her fingers to the spot where Buddy kept nudging. For a brief moment, her heartbeat quickened. Was something there? A lump? A strange tightness? She pushed the thought away almost immediately. It was nothing. Just her imagination, fueled by a restless dog on a rainy night. The window rattled slightly as the wind picked up outside, droplets of rain tapping steadily against the glass. The clock ticked louder in the quiet, counting the seconds between, her doubt, and the moment she finally chose to pull the blanket higher over her shoulders. "You're just restless, boy," she whispered, running a soothing hand down Buddy's back. "Go to sleep." Buddy hesitated, his body stiff, his head tilting slightly as if considering her words. Then, slowly, he curled up beside her, his warm fur brushing against her arm. But his eyes remained open, watching, waiting. Sarah's breathing evened out as she drifted into uneasy sleep. The night deepened, the rain softened, but Buddy never moved. His gaze remained fixed on the place where danger lingered, unseen and unspoken, in the quiet of the dark. The town woke slowly each morning, wrapped in the golden glow of the rising sun. It was a place where the days moved at an easy, unhurried pace, where neighbors waved as they walked past white picket fences, and where the biggest excitement was the weekly farmers' market. Sarah Collins had lived here all her life. She knew the streets, the faces, the rhythm of each passing season. Her life was simple, steady, and filled with quiet joys. But the greatest of them all was Buddy. Buddy had been by her side for 6 years, a golden retriever with a heart as warm as his honey-colored fur. He followed her like a shadow, from morning coffee on the porch to afternoon walks beneath the oak trees lining their quiet street. He waited patiently as she graded papers, his head resting on her lap, and greeted her with boundless energy when she came home from school. To Sarah, he was more than just a pet. He was family. But something had changed. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable. Buddy, usually content with his predictable routine, began acting different. He lingered closer to her, his watchful eyes tracking her every move. He hesitated on their walks, stopping more frequently to glance up at her, his ears flicking at something only he could sense. Sarah laughed it off, brushing a hand over his head. "Getting clingy in your old age, huh?" she teased. Then the change became undeniable. Buddy's nose pressed insistently against her side whenever she sat down, his body tense, his whimpers soft but relentless. At first, Sarah ignored it, thinking he was just being affectionate. But it continued. He pawed at her shirt when she got dressed, sniffing the same spot over and over. He nudged her ribs when she lay on the couch, his breath warm and quick, eyes filled with something Sarah didn't understand. Concern flickered in her mind, but she pushed it away. A few days later, Sarah took Buddy to visit her best friend, Dr. Emily Harris, the town's veterinarian. Emily had known Buddy since he was a puppy, and as she examined him, she noticed something unusual in his behavior. "He's fixated on one spot," Emily murmured, watching as Buddy sniffed Sarah's side for the 10th time. Sarah shrugged. "He's been acting weird lately. Maybe he's just needy." Emily didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "Sarah," she said carefully, "there have been cases where dogs detect illnesses in their owners. Cancer. Even, it's rare, but maybe Buddy's trying to tell you something." Sarah blinked, then snorted. "Oh, come on. He probably just likes my new lotion." She scratched behind Buddy's ears, feeling silly even entertaining the idea. "I'm perfectly fine." Emily gave her a small smile but didn't look convinced. "Maybe, but if he keeps doing it, maybe you should get it checked out." Sarah laughed off the thought, but that night, as she lay in bed, Buddy curled tightly against her side. Doubt crept in. The next day, over coffee with her best friend Megan, she casually mentioned Buddy's behavior. Megan chuckled, shaking her head. "Maybe he's just obsessed with you. You're his whole world, you know." At school, her students giggled when Buddy followed her too closely during a video call. "Miss Collins, your dog loves you so much," one of them said. But later that evening, when she spoke to her mother, the conversation took a different turn. "Sarah," her mother's voice softened, "dogs have instincts. They notice things before we do. Maybe you should listen." Sarah sighed. It was just Buddy being Buddy. Loyal, loving, attentive. Still, what if? Curiosity finally got the best of her. One evening, as she changed into her pajamas, she hesitated in front of the mirror, pressing her fingers against the spot Buddy had been nudging. Her heart stopped. Beneath her fingertips, a small lump. Unfamiliar. Unnoticed until now. A chill ran through her, leaving her breathless. Was this what Buddy had been trying to warn her about all along? She sat on the edge of her bed, pressing the spot again as if expecting it to disappear. It didn't. Buddy, resting beside her, lifted his head, his eyes full of quiet knowing. He let out a soft whimper, nudging her knee with his nose. Her hands trembled. If she had ignored him, if she had brushed it off as nothing. Sarah swallowed hard. She had been laughing before. She wasn't laughing now. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh paper. A soft murmur of conversation filled the space, punctuated by the occasional rustling of magazines being flipped absent-mindedly. Sarah sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her fingers twisting together as she watched the minute hand on the wall clock inch forward. She had come expecting reassurance, a routine checkup to confirm what she already knew, that Buddy's strange behavior had been nothing more than a fluke, an overprotective dog sensing stress. Dr. Patel's office was warm, the sunlight filtering through cream-colored blinds. He greeted her with his usual calm smile, his glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose as he reviewed her chart. "Let's take a look," he said, his voice steady, reassuring. But when he pressed against the spot where she had found the lump, his expression shifted just slightly, so slight that most wouldn't have noticed. But Sarah did. She heard the change in his voice when he spoke, again softer this time. "I'd like to run some tests just to be sure." Her heart tapped an uneasy rhythm against her ribs. "Tests?" "It's probably nothing," he said quickly, but his careful wording sent a chill down her spine. "But let's check, just in case." The next hour was a blur. Scans, blood work, a technician's gentle voice instructing her to hold still, as she lay beneath the cold hum of a machine. Then came the moment that changed everything. Dr. Patel sat across from her, his hands folded neatly on his desk, the scan results placed between them like an unspoken weight. His voice was soft, steady, but the words hit her like a wave of ice. "Sarah, we found something." The air in the room seemed to thin, making it harder to breathe. Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair as the words tumbled forward. It's early-stage breast cancer. The world shrank. The words repeated in her mind, looping endlessly as if they would make more sense the second time. She felt untethered, floating outside of herself, her body frozen in place while her thoughts raced, desperate to rewind time to before this moment. Dr. Patel's voice reached her as if through water, gentle but firm. We caught it early. That's the important thing. Early. The word echoed, but it didn't quiet the fear clawing its way up her throat. She nodded, because what else could she do? Her fingers curled into her palms, and she forced herself to breathe. When she stepped out of the office, the air outside felt heavier, as though the sky itself had pressed down against her shoulders. The parking lot was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Buddy sat waiting in the passenger seat of her car, his tail wagging the moment he saw her. Her legs trembled as she opened the door, and the moment she slid into the seat, Buddy moved. He pressed his head against her knee, warm and steady, his breath slow and rhythmic. She ran her fingers through his fur, and for the first time since hearing the diagnosis, the weight in her chest cracked just slightly. He had known. He had been trying to tell her all along. A lump formed in her throat as she whispered, "You saved me." Buddy let out a soft exhale, leaning into her touch, his eyes filled with something she finally understood. It was terrifying to think of what could have happened if she had ignored him, if she had brushed his warnings aside as nothing, more than odd behavior. If she had waited, if she had dismissed him, how much time would she have lost? Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She had always believed that Buddy was special. But now she knew he was something more. Fear, relief, and gratitude tangled together inside her. She had been given a second chance, one that so many never got. And what about others? How many people had dogs like Buddy, loyal, loving companions whose instincts were dismissed, ignored, or misunderstood? How many lives could be saved if the world simply listened? She had to tell someone. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone for a long time before dialing. Dr. Emily Harris answered on the second ring. "Sarah?" Sarah took a shaky breath. "Emily, I need your help." Within hours, Emily had reached out to a leading research facility studying canine scent detection and cancer diagnosis. The response was immediate. They wanted to meet Buddy, so. Sarah sat beside him on the couch, running her fingers through his fur. A thought settled deep inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. Buddy had saved her life. Now, he might save thousands more. Sarah's world had become a war zone. One battle raged inside her body. A quiet war fought in hospital rooms and under the watchful eyes of doctors. Chemotherapy left her drained, her once steady hands trembling as she ran them over Buddy's fur. Surgery carved away the threat, but at the cost of pieces of herself. The mirror reflected a stranger, pale, weakened, her hair thinning with every passing week. And yet she fought, because she had no other choice. But outside the walls of her home, another battle brewed, one she never saw coming. It started with a local news article, a feel-good piece about a dog who had sniffed out his owner's cancer before medical tests could. Then came a national segment. Then the reporters. They knocked on her door, cameras flashing, voices eager, asking the same question over and over. How did he know? The story spread like wildfire. Scientists debated it. Headlines called Buddy a miracle. Strangers left messages of support, while others scoffed at the idea. Some claimed it was a fluke, that she was just looking for attention, and then came the ones who saw Buddy not as a hero, but as a threat. Mark Reynolds had built his empire on cutting-edge cancer diagnostics, and the thought of a golden retriever, detecting tumors better than million-dollar machines, made his stomach churn. If this was real, if dogs could do what his lab spent years perfecting, what did that mean for the industry? What did it mean for him? He watched the news footage, fingers tapping against his desk. The headlines painted a story he refused to believe. He had seen false hope before, had watched it fail in the worst way. His wife had once begged him to listen when she felt something was wrong. The tests had come back clear, the doctors reassured her, and Mark had believed them. He had placed his faith in technology, in medicine. By the time they found the cancer, it was too late. Now this dog threatened to shake the very foundation of everything he had built. Sarah, meanwhile, just wanted to heal. The noise, the media, the skepticism. It was all too much. She hadn't asked for any of this. She wanted to focus on her recovery, to find strength again, but the pressure was relentless. Scientists reached out, eager to study Buddy's ability. Doctors debated whether animals could be integrated into medical screenings, but Sarah hesitated. Would they use Buddy for research? Would they take him away from her? Buddy, oblivious to the chaos, stayed at her side. He didn't understand the cameras, the news stories, the arguments. All he knew was that Sarah was sick and he wasn't leaving her. The world debated his instincts. He only cared about her. Reynolds grew more determined. He spoke publicly, dismissing Buddy's abilities as chance. He warned against trusting a dog's nose over real medicine. But it wasn't just skepticism. It was fear. Fear that he had been wrong before, and fear that this dog had done something science could not. Sarah stood at a crossroads. If she stepped forward, if she agreed to the trials, she risked everything. Buddy's peace, her own privacy, the life she had before. But if she stayed silent, if she let the world forget, how many lives might be lost? The weight of the decision pressed down on her. The world was waiting. The research facility buzzed with anticipation. Cameras were set up, notebooks were flipped open, and hushed voices murmured behind closed doors. The air was thick with skepticism and curiosity. At the center of it all stood Buddy, his golden fur gleaming under the fluorescent lights, tail swishing slowly. He didn't understand the tension in the room, nor the high stakes riding on his performance. He only knew one thing. Sarah was watching, and that was enough. A row of metal trays lined the lab table, each holding a sample. Some belonged to healthy patients, others to those battling cancer. The test was simple. Buddy would be led down the line, and he would either react or move on. The scientists stood rigid, medical professionals clutching their pens with white-knuckled grips. Could this really be happening? Could a dog truly detect what advanced technology sometimes failed to? A deep breath. A signal. The test began. Buddy sniffed the first sample. No reaction. He moved on. The second, the third, nothing. Then, on the fourth, he paused. His ears perked, his nose twitched, and he sat down, his tail going still. One scientist scribbled something on a clipboard. Another exchanged glances with their colleague. The next tray. Buddy walked past two more, ignoring them completely. But then, another stop. His body stiffened, and he let out a low, steady whimper. A murmur rippled through the room. He was doing it. With unwavering precision, Buddy continued down the line, identifying each cancerous sample, leaving the healthy ones untouched. One by one, he sat in front of every positive case, his quiet confirmation shaking the air more than any loud proclamation ever could. The room fell into stunned silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a voice broke through. My God. Sarah sat in the corner, her hands clenched together. She had seen Buddy do this before, but here, under the scrutiny of the world, it felt different. It felt final. The cameras clicked, the doctors whispered. The scientists, who had come with, their skepticism sharp as knives, found themselves holding their breath. And then, as if on instinct, Sarah stood. Her legs were weak, her body still recovering from treatment, but her voice was steady. What Buddy did for me, she began, he could do for so many others. The room shifted toward her, all attention now locked on the woman who had been at the center of it all. I was just like everyone else. I thought he was being clingy, acting strangely. I ignored him. If I had waited, if I had brushed him off as just a dog, her breath hitched. I wouldn't be standing here right now. The weight of her words settled like dust over the gathered crowd. Across the room, Mark Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair, his arms crossed tightly. His face was unreadable, but something in his eyes flickered, a crack in the carefully built walls he had spent years constructing. Buddy had identified every sample correctly, not once, not twice, but over and over again. There was no mistake, no fluke. Mark's throat tightened. He had spent years dismissing this kind of thing, calling it unreliable, unscientific. But the truth was, he hadn't just been fighting Buddy. He had been fighting his own regrets. His wife had told him, hadn't she? She had felt something long before the tests caught it. She had known, and he hadn't listened. His fingers curled into fists on his lap. Sarah's voice was still ringing in his ears. If I had waited, I wouldn't be standing here right now. He swallowed hard. He could keep fighting this, keep arguing against what was right in front of him, or he could do what he should have done all those years ago. He could listen. The room was still. Then, slowly, Mark stood. All eyes turned toward him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice that was quieter than usual, heavier, he spoke. I didn't believe this was possible. His gaze shifted toward Buddy, who sat calmly beside Sarah, his head resting against her knee. I didn't want to believe it. A breath. A pause. But I was wrong. The words hung in the air, fragile and powerful. His voice wavered as he continued. If I had listened to my wife's instincts, she might still be alive. His jaw tightened, his throat bobbing as he forced himself to say the words that had haunted him for years. I trusted machines over intuition, over the simplest of signs. He exhaled sharply, and I lost her. The tension in the room shifted, a tide turning. I don't want anyone else to make that mistake. A moment later, he stepped forward. I want to fund this research. His eyes met Sarah's. Not to fight it, to prove it. The shock in the room was palpable. Sarah stared at him, searching his face for any trace of deception. There was none. It was real. Mark Reynolds, the man who had opposed this, who had dismissed Buddy as a threat, was now their greatest ally. And in that moment, something else happened. Sarah's doctor approached, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He held a folder in his hands. Sarah, he said gently, I have some news. Her stomach tightened. He handed her the folder, nodding toward it. With shaky hands, she opened it, scanning the paper inside. Then, the world around. Her blurred, her heart thundered in her chest. Tears stung her eyes. Your treatment is working, the doctor said. Your cancer is responding well, significantly well. She blinked, trying to process the words. Then, Buddy nudged her hand, and she let out a choked laugh, covering her mouth as relief flooded through her. He had done it. He hadn't just changed. Science. He had saved her life. The morning air was crisp and full of promise. Sarah stepped outside for the first time in weeks without feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her chest. She inhaled deeply, the scent of damp earth and fresh-cut grass filling her lungs, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a patient. She felt like a survivor. At her side, Buddy stood tall, his golden fur gleaming in the soft sunlight. His tail wagged lazily, his warm brown eyes scanning the familiar world around them. He had been with her through it all, the diagnosis, the treatment, the fear, and now, as she stood on the other side of it, he was still there, just as steady, just as loyal. The world had changed because of him. His story had spread far beyond their quiet town, reaching hospitals, research labs, and people who had never believed in something as simple as a dog's love being powerful enough to save a life. Scientists had taken notice, launching a program to study canine cancer detection. What had once been dismissed as coincidence was now the foundation of something greater. Sarah walked through town, Buddy at her side, and saw the way people smiled at them now. The same neighbors who had once shaken their heads in doubt now stopped to pet Buddy, to thank him. The same town that had watched from the sidelines now celebrated him as their own, a quiet hero, proof that sometimes instinct was stronger than science. And there, in the heart of this transformation, was Mark Reynolds. Once an opponent, now a believer, he had taken his grief and turned it into something meaningful. The research center he funded in his wife's name stood tall, a beacon of second chances. He had spent years running from his regrets, but in the end, he had found his way back. He had found purpose in the place he least expected. For Sarah, the journey was far from over. She and Buddy traveled now, not to chase fame, but to share their story, to stand in hospital rooms and classrooms, teaching people that sometimes the answers weren't in machines, but in the quiet nudges of a friend who refused to be ignored. One evening, as the sky burned in hues of pink and gold, Sarah sat on the porch with Buddy curled beside her. She ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the quiet hum of the world moving on. "You saved my life," she murmured, pressing a kiss to his head. Buddy sighed, shifting closer, his tail thumping softly against the wooden floor. His job wasn't done, not yet, because the smallest act of kindness, the softest nudge, the quietest warning, can be the spark that changes everything.